This is Block 9, the Liberal Establishment, Section 4, the Rise and Fall of Richard Nixon, with the section Nixon's Resignation. As soon as that smoking gun tape came out, the House Judiciary Committee began to draw up articles of impeachment. The charges that the House were drawing up were obstruction of justice, abuse of power of the office, and contempt of the Congress. The public's reaction to the tapes was overwhelming. 21 short months after his incredible landslide in which he won 49 states, Nixon lost all support amongst the nation. He now was dealing with a hostile Congress, a hostile press, a hostile Supreme Court, and a nation that had turned its back on the man that they had elected twice. Nixon was left with nowhere left to turn. Finally, his own party turned decisively against him. Senator Goldwater, kind of the elder statesman of the Republican Party, approached Nixon in the White House and informed him that most Republicans in Congress would be voting to impeach, and then most senators would be voting to remove him, and he himself, Senator Goldwater, would also be probably voting to remove President Nixon from power. Goldwater urged him to resign rather than put the country through a presidential impeachment, trial, and removal. There had not been a presidential impeachment since 1868. There had not been a presidential trial since 1868. There was, times were tough. There was diplomatic issues. There was problems in the Middle East. Senator Goldwater said to President Nixon, "Mr. President, if you decide to fight this, you will lose. And you will lose overwhelmingly, that even your own party can no longer support you, Mr. President. And I respectfully suggest," he said, I respectfully suggest that you resign in the next few days. And Goldwater left. That was it. Nixon had literally nowhere else to go. Nixon was a fighter. He had been a fighter his whole life. He came from a working class background. He had fought for everything he had ever had, and now he had thrown it all away due to his own, personality flaws. He got on television on the night of August 8th and announced that he would resign the presidency at noon the next day. With tears in his eyes, he told the country that he had not meant to do anything wrong. He asked for their forgiveness. The nation was particularly unmoved. The next day, August 9th, 1974, as you see in the picture, Nixon left the White House in disgrace, got aboard Marine One helicopter, and resigned the office of the presidency, the only president ever to do such a thing. Nixon was brought down by his own hubris, his own inability to compromise. If Nixon had come out at the very beginning, and said, "Look, these these thuggy idiots broke into the Democratic National Headquarters. I don't approve of it, and I'm going to win an election without having to cheat," the American people would have been perfectly fine with that, and Watergate never would have happened. But Nixon's reputation for secrecy and Nixon's paranoia led him to instead actively work to cover it up. And the cover-up is usually worse than the crime. In this case, the cover-up was definitely worse than the crime. And as the press tried to dig out the cover-up, they also undug lots of particularly unsavory things about Nixon's administration. Stuff that happened in almost every administration, but there it was. The press found it, published it, and the American people turned against their president. That we like our presidents to be moral, upstanding people. Most people, even if they don't like President Obama, appreciate the fact that he's a faithful husband and a good father, and he's a role model for his children. People don't like their president to be a crook, and it turned out that Nixon, through his own faults, was indeed a crook. He is replaced, as we saw, here's good old Gerald Ford. Gerald Ford becomes the only president in American history to assume the presidency neither being elected to the presidency or the vice president. Remember, Ford had been picked by Nixon after Spiro Agnew had resigned. Gerald Ford was a successful and popular congressman from Michigan. He had been an All-American football player from the University of Michigan, but he wasn't even a senator. He was a congressman, had no experience on the international stage, was not famous for writing lots of important bills and laws. He had never even run for statewide office, let alone national office. You know, the biggest office he had ever won was his small little 12th congressional district in Michigan. However, President Ford, Gerald Ford, was now the commander-in-chief of all those nuclear missiles and the leader of the free world. The first thing that Ford did indeed take quite a bit of courage. He granted a full presidential pardon to President Nixon. He pardoned him for any actions that Nixon took in the past that had anything to do with Watergate or anything to do with Watergate. Democrats screamed foul. They wanted blood. They wanted Nixon to be hauled into a courtroom and put in jail for a long, long time. Democrats screamed foul. They said that Nixon had only picked Ford because he knew eventually he was going to have to resign, and he made a deal with Ford that he would pardon him in exchange for pretty much making Ford president of the United States. There's no evidence for this. It's merely, you believe something you want to believe, that so many people disliked Richard Nixon so much that they believe. And you look, he did a lot of shady things on those tapes. There was nothing on the tapes about cutting a deal with Gerald Ford. So Gerald Ford's given reason is probably the reason for what he did. Ford got on television, spoke to the nation, and most people tuned in. He spoke calmly, and he explained to the whole nation that to put the former president through a trial would have just lengthened a national nightmare. That people had been focusing on this for a year and a half now. The economy was bad, there had been a war in the Middle East, and still every day, Watergate, 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 Watergate. Ford said the country does not need another trial. Richard Nixon's punishment was the fact that he was going to be a pariah for a long time, that he would go down in history as the only president to have to resign his office, and that to Ford was punishment enough. Ford said that the American people had to put the past behind them and focus on not what Richard Nixon did, but what was Gerald Ford going to do now to solve the problems that the country was having, and those problems were starting to multiply. Ford's decision, in the light of history, was a good one. Richard Nixon embarrassed himself, besmirched the office of the President of the United States, but in the end, a full trial for Citizen Nixon would have merely created another superstorm of media activity to the detriment of the serious problems that were in fact going on. But Ford's pardon of Nixon came at a very high cost. When Ford became president, most of the people supported him. They said, look, this guy's become president, it's a tough situation, we'll kind of get behind him. As soon as Ford pardoned Nixon, that support evaporated. And Ford became an unelected president in tough economic and tough international times, with all of the public bad will for having pardoned Richard Nixon. History has seen Ford's move as a lot better than his contemporaries in 1974 did. But it did seriously hurt President Ford's chance for re-election in 1976. That's the rise and fall of Richard Nixon. The only president to resign. If he had not resigned, he would have been impeached for some shady activities, including a cover-up of a break-in at Democratic National Headquarters. That trail was followed all the way back to the White House. Nixon finally had to release the tapes, and when he did, it was the country realized that indeed President Nixon had participated in a vast cover-up to hide the truth from the American people. and for that he was forced from his office.